The sharp click of Sloane Kensington's stilettos echoed through the vast, empty marble hallway of Kensington Holdings. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the endless grid of city lights. Her posture was perfect. Her tailored white suit was flawless. But inside her chest, a quiet storm was raging. Her Aunt Victoria's words from the evening board meeting still burned in the air. A CEO needs stability, Sloane. The board will not hand the empire to a single woman with no family ties. You have 30 days to present a stable married life, or you step down. It was a cruel ancient rule hidden in her late father's will, a trap designed by her own family to strip her of the company she had bled for. Sloane did not build her empire to lose it to archaic traditions. She needed a solution, a transaction. A man desperate enough to sign a marriage contract, stand by her side for the cameras, and disappear when the ink dried. Her private investigator had placed a thin grey file on her desk 2 days ago. Elias Vance, 32 years old, mechanic, widowed 3 years ago, drowning in overwhelming medical debt from his late wife's battle with cancer, raising a 5-year-old daughter entirely alone. He was perfect on paper. Desperate, broken, easy to buy. The next morning, Sloane's black, luxury sedan pulled into the gravel driveway of a worn-out mechanic shop on the edge of the city. The air here was heavy. It smelled of motor oil, hot dust, and old iron. It was a world completely foreign to Sloane. She stepped out of her car, the sound of her expensive heels crunching against the loose gravel. People in the neighborhood stopped and stared. Quick, measuring eyes that looked at her suit and immediately knew she did not belong. She ignored them. Power had taught her to walk through judgment, as if it were wind. She walked toward the open bay doors of the garage. The rhythmic sound of metal clanking against metal echoed from the dark interior. And then she saw him. Elias Vance was half hidden under the hood of a rusted pickup truck. He wore dark blue coveralls stained with years of hard labor. His shoulders were broad, carrying the heavy tension of a man who worked until his bones ached. He did not hear her approach. "Excuse me," Sloane said. Her voice was controlled, practiced in boardrooms designed to command attention. Elias stopped. He slowly pulled himself out from under the truck and wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop towel. He looked at her. His eyes were deep brown, quiet, and impossibly steady. There was no fear in them, no intimidation at the sight of wealth, just the calm exhaustion of a father trying to survive the day. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, grounded and polite, but entirely unbothered by her presence. "Are you Elias Vance?" Sloane asked, keeping her distance from the oil-slicked floor. "I am." Elias tossed the towel onto a workbench. "You look lost. The luxury dealership is about 10 miles north." "I am exactly where I intend to be," Sloane replied. Her eyes quickly scanned the shop. It was struggling. Tools were organized, but visibly old. The roof had a visible leak near the corner. Every detail confirmed the file on her desk. Poverty, struggle, need. Before she could speak again, a small movement caught her eye. Over by a stack of large tires, a little girl was sitting quietly on an overturned milk crate. She wore a faded yellow dress. Her hair was neatly braided, fastened with tiny, colorful beads. On her lap rested a plastic lunchbox with a broken latch. She was carefully eating half of a sandwich, saving the other half. Sloane felt a strange tightness in her throat. The girl's eyes met hers. They were identical to her father's, deep, watchful, and carrying too much understanding for a 5-year-old. "Maya," Elias said softly, his entire demeanor shifting the moment he addressed the child. His voice lost its rough edge, replaced by profound, gentle warmth. "Put the lunchbox back in the cooler when you are done." "Okay, baby." "Yes, Daddy," Maya whispered. Sloane watched the exchange. In the corporate world, emotional attachment was a liability. But here in this dusty garage, it was the only thing holding the walls up. She forced her focus back to the business at hand. Mr. Vance Sloane began reaching into her designer bag. "I am Sloane Kensington. I am the CEO of Kensington Holdings. I have a business proposition for you. Elias crossed his arms. The muscles in his forearms flexed slightly beneath the grime. I fix cars, Ms. Kensington. If your engine is knocking, pull it into the bay. If not, I have work to do. This is not about cars, Sloane said smoothly. She pulled a thick cream-colored envelope from her bag. It is about your debts. Elias froze. The air in the garage suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The rhythmic sounds of the neighborhood seemed to vanish, leaving only the heavy silence between them. He looked at the envelope, then slowly up to her face. His jaw tightened. Who told you about my debts? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sloane did not flinch. Information is my business. I know about the hospital bills. I know the bank is threatening to take this shop by the end of the month. I know you are working 16-hour shifts to keep that little girl fed. Elias took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming, yet he maintained a dignified restraint. Do not bring my daughter into whatever game you are playing. I am not playing a game, Sloane said, holding out the envelope. Inside this envelope is a cashier's check that will clear every debt you owe. It will secure this shop. It will put money in a college fund for Maya. Elias stared at the pristine white envelope hovering over his dirty floor. The temptation of survival was staring him right in the face. Months of sleepless nights. The constant suffocating fear of the bank taking his livelihood. It could all end right now. And what does it cost, Elias asked. Because people like you do not give away salvation for free. Sloane met his gaze. It costs your name. For 6 months. I need a husband on paper. I need a family image to satisfy my board of directors. You sign the contract, we make a few public appearances. You take the money, and we return to our separate lives. Elias looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the expensive clothes, the perfect makeup, the cold efficiency. But beneath it, he saw a woman completely disconnected from reality. A woman who thought money could bypass human dignity. He did not shout. He did not get angry. He simply reached out and took the envelope from her hand. For a brief second, Sloane felt a familiar wave of corporate satisfaction. The transaction was complete. Everyone had a price. But Elias did not open it. He did not look at the numbers. He looked at Sloane Wonderclay with a quiet, devastating pity, then handed the envelope right back to her. Sloane stood perfectly still. The expensive cream paper of the envelope felt unnaturally heavy as Elias pressed it back into her palm. In her world, money was the ultimate language. It commanded respect. It silenced arguments. It bought loyalty. She had never offered a sum this large to someone so desperate only to have it handed back with absolute calm. You did not even look at the number, Sloane said. Her voice lost a fraction of its corporate polish, replaced by genuine confusion. I do not need to look at it, Elias replied. He turned back to the workbench, picking up a heavy metal wrench. His movements were steady, unhurried. The debt is mine. I will carry it. You are being foolish, Sloane pushed, stepping closer to the grease-stained bench. The scent of motor oil, burnt rubber, and old iron filled her lungs. I did the math, Mr. Vance. At your current rate of income, assuming you do not eat or sleep, it will take you 11 years to pay off the hospital bills. By then, your daughter will be 16. You will have missed her entire childhood, working beneath broken cars just to keep the bank from taking your home. Elias stopped. The wrench in his hand clattered against the metal table. He turned around, and for the first time Sloane saw the raw, unfiltered weight of his grief. His eyes were dark, burning with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Do not pretend to care about my daughters. Childhood, Elias said softly. His voice was not angry, which somehow made it more terrifying. It was heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had watched his world burn down and rebuilt it with bare hands. You came here to buy a prop for your boardroom. You looked at my life, my dead wife, my debt, and you saw a discount. Sloane felt a sudden sharp twist in her stomach. The word discount hit her like a physical blow. I am offering you a way out. Sloane defended her chest, rising faster under her tailored suit. I am offering you survival. You are offering me a cage, Elias corrected. A golden one, maybe. But a cage. He looked down at his rough, scarred hands. When my wife was dying in that hospital, I held her hand. I promised her I would raise Maya to know what real love looks like. Real respect. If I sell my name to a stranger, just to clear a banknote, how do I look my daughter in the eye? What do I tell her when she asks why her father stood next to a woman who bought him like a used truck? Sloane swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, as if the dusty air of the garage was suddenly too thick to breathe. She was completely unarmed. Her MBA, her corporate strategies, her ruthless negotiation tactics, none of it worked in this room. Elias Vance was stripping away her armor with nothing but quiet dignity. He was not intimidated by her wealth. He simply pitied her reliance on it. Before Sloane could formulate a response, a soft sound broke the heavy silence. The scraping of a plastic crate against the concrete floor. Maya walked over. Her faded yellow dress caught the sunlight filtering through the open bay doors. Her tiny, worn-out sneakers stopped just inches away from Sloane's expensive white stilettos. The visual contrast was startling. Two entirely different worlds touching on a stained garage floor. Sloane looked down. Maya was holding half of her sandwich in one hand and a slightly crumpled paper napkin in the other. The little girl tilted her head, studying Sloane's face with eyes that were far too observant for her age. "You are breathing very fast," Maya said gently. Her voice was small, like a quiet bell in the harsh garage. "My mummy used to breathe like that when the medicine made her chest hurt." "Does your chest hurt?" Sloane froze. The question bypassed every defensive wall she had spent years building. No one ever asked if Sloane Kensington was hurting. They asked for her signature. They asked for her approval. They asked for her money. But a 5-year-old girl in a dusty garage was looking at her with pure, unfiltered empathy. "I am fine," Sloane managed to say, but her voice cracked slightly. She hated how vulnerable she sounded. Maya shook her head. "You look sad. Daddy says people who wear very tight clothes and never smile are usually just lonely." She held out the crumpled napkin. "You are squeezing your bag very hard. Your hands are shaking." Sloane looked down at her own hands. Maya was right. Her knuckles were white where she was gripping her designer leather bag. Her pulse was racing. She slowly released her grip, taking the napkin from the child. Her fingers brushed against Maya's small, warm hand, sending a strange jolt of humanity straight to Sloane's chest. Then Maya did something that completely shattered Sloane's composure. She held up the half-eaten sandwich. "You can have this," Maya offered. "You do not have to buy my daddy to have a family. You can just sit down and eat with us. Daddy says food tastes better when you share it." A painful lump formed in Sloane's throat. Her eyes burned. The sheer innocence of the offer, the profound kindness from a child who had absolutely nothing, was devastating. Maya was offering her only meal to a billionaire who had just tried to buy her father. Elias stepped forward, gently placing a large protective hand on Maya's shoulder. "Go back to the cooler, baby," he said softly. "The lady is just leaving." Sloane looked from the little girl to the towering, quiet man. She suddenly felt profoundly small. She realized that despite her massive empire, her offshore bank accounts and her board power, Elias and Maya Vance were infinitely richer than she was. They had each other. They had honor. They had a peace that Sloane had never tasted in her entire life. Sloane took a trembling step back. "I apologize," she whispered. The words tasted strange in her mouth. She had not apologized to anyone in years. "I was entirely out of line." She turned and walked out of the garage. The gravel crunched under her heels, but her steps were no longer confident. They were hurried, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of her own guilt. When she reached her luxury sedan, she sat in the driver's seat and locked the doors. The silence of the soundproof cabin enveloped her. The air conditioning kicked in cold and sterile. She leaned her forehead against the leather steering wheel and closed her eyes. Her chest heaved. The image of Maya's little hand holding out that sandwich played over and over in her mind. Suddenly, the sharp ringtone of her cell phone shattered the quiet. She sat up, taking a deep breath to compose herself, and answered the call. "Sloane, darling," Aunt Victoria's smooth, venomous voice floated through the speaker. "I just wanted to remind you." The clock is ticking. You have 28 days left. Have you found a suitable husband yet? Or should I start preparing my acceptance speech for the CEO transition? Sloane gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white again. The predatory nature of her own bloodline made her stomach churn, especially after just witnessing the pure loyalty in Elias Vance's garage. I have it under control, Victoria Sloane said coldly. Make sure you do, Victoria purred. Because if you fail, I will not just take the company. I will sell your father's legacy for parts and completely erase your name from the board. The line went dead. Sloane stared out the window at the worn-out mechanic shop in the distance. The corporate sharks were circling her tower, but her mind was entirely anchored to a man with grease-stained hands and a child with a broken lunchbox. She knew she could not walk away. The transaction had failed, but a dangerous, unscripted connection had just begun. For 3 days, Sloane Kensington could not focus. The sprawling glass walls of her penthouse office suddenly felt like a sterile cage. The towering spreadsheets, the aggressive emails from board members, the subtle threats from Aunt Victoria, everything that usually fueled her ambition now tasted like ash. Every time she closed her eyes, she did not see her corporate empire. She saw a dusty garage floor, a grease-stained hand pushing away, a fortune and a little girl offering her half a sandwich. By Tuesday afternoon, the silence in her office became unbearable. She stood up, grabbed her keys, and walked out right in the middle of a quarterly review preparation. Her assistant called out her name in confusion, but Sloane kept walking. She took the private elevator to the underground garage, got into her black sedan, and drove without a destination. But her subconscious already knew exactly where she was going. The address from the private investigator's file was burned into her memory: Oak Creek Elementary. It was a modest public school in a working-class neighborhood, 30 minutes and 1,000,000 miles away from her corporate tower. Sloane parked her luxury car across the street from the main gate, keeping the engine running and the tinted windows rolled up. The 3:00 bell rang its sharp mechanical buzz, piercing the afternoon air. A sea of children flooded out of the double doors. The sidewalk instantly became a chaotic mix of bright backpacks, loud laughter, and exhausted parents waiting by their cars. Sloane watched the crowd, her fingers tapping nervously against the leather steering wheel. Then she spotted him. Elias Vance parked his rusted pickup truck a few yards down the street. He stepped out, and the physical contrast between him and the rest of the world was immediate. He was still wearing his dark blue work coveralls. His boots were heavily scuffed. His hands were dark with motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. He looked bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a man's spine. But the moment his eyes scanned the crowd and found his daughter, his entire posture transformed. The heavy weight vanished, replaced by a radiant, towering gentleness. Maya ran toward him, her faded yellow backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. "Daddy!" she yelled, throwing her arms around his knees. Elias let out a low, warm laugh. He bent down, ignoring the dirt on the sidewalk, and scooped her up into his arms. He buried his face in her neck, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping his gravity tethered to the earth. Sloane watched as Elias set her down and gently took her backpack. He unzipped it and pulled out the same plastic lunchbox from the garage, the one with the broken latch. "Did you eat everything?" Baby Elias asked, inspecting the empty plastic container inside. "I shared my apple with Leo because he dropped his," Maya said proudly. Elias smiled, smoothing her braided hair. "Good girl, we always look out for our people." Inside the cold, quiet cabin of her car, Sloane's breath hitched. A strange, heavy pressure bloomed behind her ribs, radiating up to her throat. Her eyes locked onto that cheap, broken plastic lunchbox. The visual anchor pulled her violently backward in time. The memory hit her so hard, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She was not a powerful CEO anymore. She was 7 years old. The Kensington mansion was massive, built of cold marble and dark mahogany. She remembered sitting alone at a dining table designed for 20 people. The ceiling was impossibly high. The silence was deafening. There was no plastic lunchbox. There was a heavy silver tray, prepared by a private chef, carrying food she did not want. She remembered staring at the grand staircase waiting for her father to come down. When he finally did, he was dressed in a sharp suit, speaking rapidly into a cell phone. He walked past the table without stopping. "Work hard today, Sloane," he had said, not looking at her. "The board needs a prodigy, not a child." No one had asked her if she ate. No one had asked if she shared her apple. No one had told her to look out for her people because in the Kensington family, people were only viewed as assets or liabilities. She had traded her entire childhood for a seat at the head of a boardroom table. She had won the empire, but sitting here watching Elias Vance, she realized she was completely, profoundly bankrupt. A sharp knock on her car window shattered the memory. Sloane jumped. She turned her head and saw a local parking enforcement officer gesturing for her to move her vehicle. She nodded quickly, putting the car in drive to circle the block. When she returned to the same spot 2 minutes later, the scene on the sidewalk had shifted. Elias was still standing by his truck, but he was no longer alone with Maya. A woman stood in front of him. She was one of the PTA mothers, dressed in pristine tennis clothes, her posture radiating an uncomfortable mixture of wealth and judgment. "Mr. Vance," the woman said. Her voice carried over the street noise, pitched just loud enough for the surrounding parents to hear. "I sent a notice home in Maya's folder last week. The funds for the Springfield trip are past due. It is only $40. Elias stood perfectly still. He placed a protective hand on Maya's shoulder, tucking her slightly behind his leg. "I know, Mrs. Gable. I told the teacher I will have the money by Friday." The woman let out a loud, dramatic sigh, crossing her arms. "Friday is too late. The buses need to be booked. I do not understand why you insist on sending her to these trips if you cannot afford the basic fees. Perhaps you should prioritize better, instead of working all hours in whatever it is you do." She looked pointedly at his grease-stained coveralls with obvious disgust. Sloane felt the blood drain from her face, followed instantly by a surge of white-hot rage. She recognized that look. It was the exact same look her Aunt Victoria gave to the waitstaff, the cruel, suffocating judgment of the upper class, looking down at someone simply fighting to survive. Elias did not yell. He did not lose his temper, his jaw clenched tightly, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked down at Maya, who was staring at the ground, understanding the humiliation even at 5 years old. "I will have the money," Elias said, his voice dangerously low, but wrapped in iron dignity. "My daughter will go on the trip. Have a good afternoon." He turned to open the truck door for Maya, but the woman was not finished. "It is just a shame," she muttered loudly to another mother walking by. "Some people really have no business raising children in that kind of environment. Look at his hands. He cannot even keep himself clean." Inside the car, Sloane stopped breathing. The rage completely consumed her corporate restraint. She did not think about the board. She did not think about the cameras or the contract. She only saw a good man being crucified for loving his child. Sloane threw the car into park. She unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the unforgiving concrete. The heavy thud of Sloane closing her car door and cut through the chaotic noise of the sidewalk. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She walked with the terrifying, predatory grace of a woman who routinely destroyed hostile corporate takeovers before breakfast. The crowd of parents naturally parted for her, the sheer authority radiating from her immaculate white suit and icy posture demanded absolute silence. She stopped directly beside Elias. She did not look at him yet. Her sharp, dark eyes locked entirely on Mrs. Gable. "Excuse me," Sloane said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and coated in pure, absolute frost. "I believe I overheard a concern regarding a $40 field trip fee." Mrs. Gable blinked, taking a step back. The local PTA mother was suddenly dwarfed by the overwhelming presence of a Fortune 500 CEO. "Yes," she stammered, trying to regain her artificial confidence. "Mr. Vance is late on his payments again. It is a matter of school policy and basic responsibility." Sloane opened her designer bag. Her movements were painfully slow, maximizing the tension in the air. She pulled out a crisp, new $100 bill and held it out, not to the woman, but letting it hover in the space between them. "Here is $100, Sloane said softly, ensuring every parent on the sidewalk could hear the lethal calm in her voice. 40 covers the child's field trip. The remaining 60 is for you to buy a book on basic human decency." Mrs. Gable's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Do not ever," Sloane stepped a fraction of an inch closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "speak to a father about his ability to provide while he is standing in front of his child. A man's worth is not measured by the dirt on his hands. It is measured by the burdens he carries without complaining. You carry nothing but gossip. Now take the money and walk away." The woman snatched the bill, completely humiliated, and hurried away toward her car without looking back. The sidewalk remained quiet for a few seconds before the normal chatter nervously resumed. Sloane took a slow breath, the roaring in her ears beginning to fade. She turned to face Elias. She expected relief, perhaps a thank you. But Elias Vance was staring at her with a jaw carved from stone. His eyes were dark and utterly unreadable. "I did not ask for your rescue, Mrs. Kensington," Elias said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. Sloane froze. "I was only trying to help. That woman was completely out of line." "I know exactly what she was," Elias replied, his tone steady but carrying a sharp edge. "But I fight my own battles, and I protect my own daughter. When you step in and throw money at people to silence them, you do not restore my dignity. You just remind everyone that I cannot afford to defend myself." The truth in his words hit Sloane like a physical strike. Her chest tightened. She had done it again. She had used money to fix a human problem, completely blind to the emotional collateral damage. She looked down suddenly, feeling ashamed of her designer suit and her offshore accounts. "I am sorry," Sloane whispered. It was the second time she had apologized to him in 3 days. "I was not trying to humiliate you. I just got so angry." Before Elias could respond, a small hand tugged gently on Sloane's perfectly pressed trousers. Sloane looked down. Maya was staring up at her, holding her faded yellow backpack. The little girl's eyes were wide and bright. "You are the sad lady from the garage," Maya said, a massive, genuine smile breaking across her face. "Did you come to share my sandwich today?" "Because I ate the apple, but I still have some crackers." The absolute purity of the child's memory completely shattered the remaining tension. The heavy anger in Elias' shoulders melted instantly. He looked down at his daughter, then back up at the billionaire CEO, standing on a cracked sidewalk in a working-class neighborhood. He let out a long, defeated exhale, running a calloused hand over his short hair. "Maya," Elias said softly, his voice returning to that warm, gentle rhythm, "I do not think the lady wants crackers." Actually, Sloane interrupted, surprising even herself. Her voice trembled slightly. "I would love some crackers, or maybe dinner, if you would allow me." Elias studied her. He looked past the corporate armor and saw the very real, very lonely woman standing underneath it. He saw the way she looked at his daughter not as a pawn for a contract, but as a lifeline. "There is a diner 2 blocks from here," Elias finally said. "It is not exactly fine dining. The booths are held together by duct tape." "I do not care about the booths," Sloane answered immediately. 10 minutes later, the CEO of Kensington Holdings was sitting in a faded red vinyl booth at a roadside diner. The neon sign outside buzzed loudly against the window. The air smelled of fried potatoes, old coffee, and bleach. It was a place she would normally buy and demolish without a second thought. But right now, sitting across from Elias and Maya, it felt like the safest room in the world. A waitress dropped 2 thick, white, ceramic mugs of black coffee on the table, sliding a plate of fries toward Maya. Sloane wrapped both hands around her mug. The heat seeped into her skin. She looked across the table. Elias had washed the heavy grease from his hands in the diner restroom, though the dark stains remained embedded in the deep lines of his palms. He was watching her, waiting for the explanation she owed him. "Why are you here?" Elias asked quietly. "You tore up the contract in your head the moment you left my shop. So why follow us?" Sloane stared down at the dark surface of her coffee. Because of the lunchbox, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias frowned slightly. The lunchbox? Sloane nodded finally, looking up to meet his eyes. I grew up in a house with 30 rooms. I had private tutors, personal chefs, drivers. But my father never once asked me if I finished my lunch. He never asked if I shared my food. He only asked for perfection. When I saw you with Maya today, I realized that I have spent my entire life building an empire, and I have absolutely nothing of value to put inside it. The diner hummed around them. Elias did not say a word. He just listened. For a man who spoke so little, his silence was incredibly loud. It was a safe harbor. I came here today to apologize properly, Sloane continued, a raw vulnerability leaking into her tone. I treated your life like a business transaction. I was desperate. My board is trying to force me out of my own company because I am unmarried. I panicked. But you were right. You cannot buy respect, and you cannot buy a family. Elias leaned back in the booth, his dark eyes softened, the defensive walls finally lowering. You are not a bad person, Miss Kensington. You are just fighting the wrong war. Please call me Sloane. He offered a very small, very tired smile. All right, Sloane, I am Elias. For the next hour, they did not talk about corporate takeovers or medical debt. They just sat together. Maya drew pictures on a paper napkin, sliding them across the table for Sloane to keep. Elias talked about the old truck he was rebuilding. Sloane found herself laughing, a genuine, unpracticed sound that felt entirely foreign in her chest. The heavy weight of her world was temporarily suspended. But reality never stays suspended forever. Sloane's phone vibrated violently against the table. The screen lit up with a text message from Aunt Victoria. The board meets early tomorrow. Bring the husband or empty your desk. Sloane's heart dropped. The beautiful illusion of the diner shattered. She looked up at Elias, her throat suddenly dry. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew it would break the fragile trust they had just built. Before she could speak, the atmosphere shifted brutally. Maya, who had been quietly eating her fries, suddenly stopped. She dropped her crayon. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table. A deep, wet, rattling sound ripped from her chest. It was a terrifying, terrible cough that sounded like tearing paper. Elias shot up from the booth instantly. The car mechanic disappeared, replaced by a panicked father. Maya, baby, look at me. Breathe. Maya could not breathe. Her lips began to turn a terrifying shade of blue. The diner erupted into chaos. Elias scooped Maya into his massive arms, his chair crashing backward onto the checkered floor. The little girl's chest heaved violently, her breaths reduced to terrifying, shallow gasps. Her eyes were wide with panic, searching for her father. My truck is too slow. Elias ground out his voice, thick with sheer terror. The hospital is 20 minutes away. My car is parked right outside, Sloane said immediately. Her corporate composure completely vanished, replaced by pure lethal adrenaline. She threw a $100 bill onto the table and grabbed her keys. Bring her, now. They rushed out into the cool night air. Sloane unlocked the luxury sedan, and Elias slid into the back seat, pulling Maya tightly against his chest. Sloane did not care about speed limits. She did not care about the cameras at the intersections. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the powerful engine roaring to life, tearing through the city streets like a dark bullet. Hold on, baby, Elias whispered in the back, his large, rough hand trembling as he stroked Maya's forehead. Daddy is right here. Keep your eyes on me, Maya. Just breathe with me. Sloane gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. In the rearview mirror, she saw the absolute devastation on Elias's face. He was a man who could lift engine blocks with his bare hands, but in the back seat of her car watching his child struggle for air, he was completely powerless. Sloane took a sharp turn, tires screeching against the asphalt, pulling into the bright red emergency bay of the city hospital. Before the car even fully stopped, Elias was out the door. Sloane left the keys in the ignition, left the doors open and ran in after them. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room hit them like a physical wall. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic, old coffee, and fear. Nurses immediately swarmed them, taking Maya from Elias' arms and placing her on a stretcher. A respiratory mask was clamped over her small face. The doors to the trauma wing swung shut, cutting Elias off from his daughter. He hit the heavy double doors with both hands. His broad shoulders heaved. He did not yell, but a low, broken sound escaped his throat. He slowly slid down the pale blue wall, sitting on the cold linoleum floor, burying his face in his grease-stained hands. Sloane stood a few feet away. In her world, when a crisis hit, she called lawyers. She drafted press releases, she fired people, but here in the sterile hallway of a hospital, her wealth was entirely useless. She could not buy oxygen. She could not negotiate with asthma. She walked over slowly. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him it would be all right. She simply lowered herself in her expensive white designer trousers, sitting directly on the dirty hospital floor right next to him. The minutes dragged into hours. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer against glass. They sat together in a row of uncomfortable plastic waiting chairs. Sloane went to the vending machine and brought back 2 small paper cups of terrible black coffee. She handed one to Elias. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. His hands were still trembling. "She died here," Elias whispered suddenly. His voice was raw, echoing in the quiet hallway. Sloane turned her head. Elias was staring straight ahead at the trauma doors. 3 years ago, Elias continued, his chest rising heavily. In a room just down this hall, the cancer took her piece by piece. I promised her I would keep Maya safe. I promised her, and now we are back here. Sloane felt a profound ache in her chest. She reached out, hesitating, for a fraction of a second before resting her hand over his. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over his rough, calloused fingers, gripping hers tightly like a lifeline. "You are keeping her safe," Elias Sloane said softly, her voice carrying a fierce, unwavering certainty. "You are the best father I have ever seen. She will be okay." The night stretched on. The hospital quieted down to a low hum. Exhaustion finally overtook Elias. His head fell forward, resting in his hands, catching a few broken moments of sleep. Sloane stayed awake. She sat beside him, guarding his peace, holding his coat. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, the heavy silence was shattered by the sharp vibration of Sloane's cell phone. She pulled it from her bag. The screen illuminated the dim hallway. Aunt Victoria. Sloane looked up at the clock. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8. The meeting that would decide her entire future. The meeting where she was supposed to walk in with a fake husband to secure her father's empire. She stood up quietly, walking down the hall, so she would not wake Elias, and answered the call. "Where are you?" Victoria's voice snapped like a whip through the speaker. "The board members are taking their seats. You have exactly 20 minutes to walk through those doors with a ring on your finger, or I am filing the motion to remove you." Sloane looked through the glass window of the hospital room. A doctor had just walked in to check on Maya. The little girl was awake, breathing steadily through a small mask. Elias was standing right beside her bed, holding her tiny hand, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The pure, overwhelming love in that room was brighter than any glass tower in the city. "I am not coming," Victoria Sloane said. Her voice was completely steady. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What did you say?" Victoria hissed. "I said I am not coming," Sloane repeated, feeling a massive, invisible weight suddenly lift from her shoulders. "You can file whatever motion you want. You can take the CEO title. You can take the corner office. I do not care anymore. I am staying right here." "Are you insane?" Victoria yelled, her aristocratic mask slipping. "You are throwing away billions for what? You are nothing without this company, Sloane." "No," Sloane replied softly. "I was nothing with it. Now I actually have somewhere to be." She hung up the phone. She did not feel panic. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of freedom. She turned around and walked back toward Maya's room. When Sloane entered, Elias looked up. The deep exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by profound relief. Maya smiled weakly behind her mask. "The doctor says she is stable. Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. We can take her home tonight. Sloane smiled, walking over to the bed. I am so glad. But then the heavy footsteps of a hospital administrator echoed in the room. The woman carried a thick clipboard, looking directly at Elias with a tight, unsympathetic expression. Mr. Vance, the administrator said coldly, we are glad your daughter is stable. However, your account is deeply in collections from your previous visits. Hospital policy dictates that before we can process the discharge for this emergency admission, we require a 40% down payment on the outstanding balance. Elias froze. The relief vanished from his face, replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of poverty. He looked down at his boots. I do not have it today, he said quietly, swallowing his pride in front of his child. Give me a week. I will work double shifts. I am sorry, Mr. Vance, the woman replied, tapping her pen. Policy is policy. We will have to transfer her to the state facility downtown until the payment clears. Elias clenched his fists. The humiliation of not being able to protect his daughter in her weakest moment was agonizing. Sloane watched the man she was falling in love with being stripped of his dignity by a clipboard. She stepped forward. She did not pull out a checkbook. She did not want to humiliate him further. Excuse me, Sloane said to the administrator, her voice returning to its absolute CEO authority. May I speak with you in the hallway for a moment? Sloane stepped outside. She pulled out a sleek, black metal credit card. You will clear Mr. Vance's entire balance, all of it, and you will put it under an anonymous donor fund. If you ever speak to that man about money in front of his child again, I will buy this hospital and turn it into a parking lot. Do we understand each other? The administrator swallowed hard, taking the card with shaking hands. Yes, ma, am. Sloane walked back into the room. Elias was looking at her. He knew what she had just done. But this time he did not see a billionaire buying a prop. He saw a partner stepping into the fire with him. But as Sloane smiled at him, her phone lit up again. It was a text from an unknown number. Attached was a photo. A picture of Sloane sitting on the hospital floor next to Elias, taken from down the hall. The text read, So the great Sloane Kensington abandoned the board for a dirty mechanic. The board demands a public explanation at the charity gala tomorrow night. Bring him, or the press gets the story of how you lost your mind. The Kensington penthouse was completely silent, save for the ticking of a massive grandfather clock in the hallway. Sloane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city. She was wearing a floor-length, emerald green silk gown that cost more than most people's vehicles. Her hair was perfectly pinned. Her makeup was flawless. But underneath the expensive armor, her hands were shaking. She had tried to tell Elias not to come. When the blackmail text arrived, she had called him, offering to face the board alone. She told him the charity gala was a snake pit, a place where people used champagne glasses to hide their venom. She told him he did not owe her this. But Elias Vance had simply listened to her panicked voice over the phone, and with that familiar, low, rumbling calm, he had said, You sat on a dirty hospital floor for my daughter. I am not letting you walk into a room full of wolves by yourself. Pick me up at 7. At exactly 7:15, Elias stepped out of his small apartment building and walked towards Sloane's waiting sedan. Sloane's breath completely caught in her throat. Elias was not wearing grease-stained coveralls. He wore a simple black suit. It was not tailored in Italy. It did not have a designer label. It was likely bought off the rack from a department store just hours ago. But the way it sat across his broad shoulders, the way he carried himself with absolute towering dignity, made him look like a king stepping onto a battlefield. He did not look out of place. He looked like the only real thing in a world of plastic. He slid into the back seat next to her. He smelled of clean soap and worn leather. He looked at her, his dark eyes taking in the emerald dress, the diamonds at her throat, and the deep anxiety in her posture. Breathe, Sloane, Elias said softly. His rough hand reached across the leather seat and gently covered hers. It is just a room full of people. They only have the power you give them. 30 minutes later, the sedan pulled up to the grand entrance of the Plaza Hotel. The Kensington Annual Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the city's elite social calendar. Flashing cameras illuminated the night like a lightning storm. Reporters shouted questions from behind velvet ropes. Valets rushed to open doors. Sloane stepped out first. The cameras fired wildly. Then Elias stepped out behind her. The physical shift in him was immediate. He placed a large, warm hand on the small of Sloane's, back a quiet, protective barrier between her and the chaotic flashes of the press. He did not shrink from the cameras. He simply ignored them, guiding her forward with a steady, unshakable rhythm. They walked into the massive grand ballroom. The ceiling was adorned with cascading crystal chandeliers. The floor was polished white marble. Waiters in white gloves floated through the room, carrying silver trays of champagne. The air was thick with expensive perfumes and hushed conversations. The moment Sloane and Elias entered, the ambient noise in the room noticeably dropped. Eyes turned. Whispers started instantly. The elite circle of Kensington Holdings knew everyone who belonged, and Elias Vance definitively did not belong. They measured his off-the-rack suit, they measured his heavy boots, they measured the rugged, unapologetic strength in his jaw. Sloane felt her chest tighten. She wanted to grab his hand and run back to the diner, back to the worn-out booths and the smell of fried potatoes. Before they could even reach their designated table, the crowd parted. Aunt Victoria glided toward them, flanked by 3 senior board members. She wore a silver gown that made her look like a polished knife. Her smile was sharp, predatory, and completely devoid of warmth. "Sloane?" Darling Victoria purred, her voice elevated just enough to ensure the surrounding tables stopped to listen. "You finally decided to grace us with your presence. We were beginning to think you abandoned your father's legacy completely." "I am here," Victoria Sloane replied, her voice cold and even. "Now step aside." Victoria let out a short, hollow laugh. She did not move. Instead, her sharp eyes slowly shifted to Elias. She looked him up and down with exaggerated confusion, treating him as if he were a stain on the marble floor. "And who is this?" Victoria asked loudly. "I was not aware we were allowing the valet staff into the main ballroom to enjoy the champagne." Several people in the immediate vicinity let out quiet, condescending chuckles. Sloane's stomach twisted violently. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Do not speak to him like that," Sloane warned, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Oh, please, Sloane." Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "The board has already received the photographs. We know you skipped the emergency meeting to sit in a public hospital waiting room. We know you used company funds to secretly pay off his medical debt." She took a step closer to Elias, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "Tell me, Mr. Vance, how much does it cost to buy a mechanic these days? Did she purchase that cheap suit for you too?" The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. The music seemed to fade. The elite crowd watched, waiting to see the working-class man crumble under the weight of high society humiliation. They expected him to blush. They expected him to yell, which would only prove he was uncivilized. They expected him to run. Elias Vance did none of those things. He slowly let go of Sloane's waist. He took one single step toward Victoria. The sheer physical presence of the man forced the older woman to involuntarily take a step back. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not look angry. He looked at Victoria with the same quiet, devastating pity he had shown Sloane, back in the dusty garage. "My name is Elias Vance," he said. His voice was a low, heavy rumble that carried effortlessly through the quiet room. "I fix cars for a living. I work 16 hours a day with my hands, so my daughter has food on her table, and yes, my suit is cheap." He slowly held up his hands. They were scrubbed clean, but the deep, dark oil stains were permanently embedded in the calluses and scars. "These hands built a life," Elias continued, locking eyes with Victoria. "These hands held my wife when she took her last breath. These hands carry my daughter when she is too tired to walk. I am not ashamed of my debt because it came from trying to save the woman I loved. I am not ashamed of my clothes because I bought them with honest money." The room was painfully still. Victoria's arrogant smirk completely vanished. Elias looked around the opulent ballroom, taking in the diamonds, the silk, and the cold, judgmental faces. I look around this room, he said softly, and I see billions of dollars, but I do not see a single person strong enough to survive one day in my world. You use money to hide how empty you are. You try to humiliate me because you cannot understand a man who cannot be bought. He turned his attention back to Victoria. The silence was so heavy it felt suffocating. Sloane did not buy me. Elias finished, his voice steady as stone. She just finally found a man who does not need her money. Someone near the back of the room actually gasped. Aunt Victoria stood completely paralyzed, her face burning with a bright, ugly red flush. The devastating moral reversal had completely stripped her of her power. She had tried to expose his poverty, but he had just exposed her absolute lack of humanity. Sloane stood beside him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Tears burned the back of her eyes. She had never in her entire life witnessed someone wield truth with such terrifying, beautiful power. The corporate empire. The glass tower, the board of directors, suddenly none of it mattered. The cameras started flashing again. The press had caught every single word. Victoria recovered slightly, her voice shaking with pure rage. "You think a pretty speech changes anything?" she hissed at Sloane. "The board votes in 10 minutes. You have disgraced this family. You will be removed as CEO tonight." Sloane looked at her aunt. Then she looked at the heavy gold Kensington signet ring on her right hand, the ring her father had given her, the ring that had shackled her to a life of cold, lonely ambition. Sloane smiled. It was the first real, genuine smile she had ever worn in this ballroom. She turned to face the crowd, the board members, and the flashing cameras. Then she did the one thing no one in the room, not even Elias, expected. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer just heavy. It was electric. Hundreds of eyes remained locked on Sloane Kensington. They waited for the ruthless CEO to strike back, to deploy her corporate lawyers, to leverage her shares, to do whatever it took to keep the throne she had bled for. Instead, Sloane slowly raised her right hand. The heavy gold Kensington signet ring caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. It was the ring her father had placed on her finger the day he died. It was supposed to be a crown. She now realized it was just a very expensive, incredibly lonely padlock. Sloane looked at the board members standing behind her aunt. She looked at the reporters leaning over the velvet ropes. Finally, she looked at Victoria. "You want a public explanation?" Sloane said, her voice projecting with absolute clarity across the vast room. "Then let us be completely honest with the press. Let us tell them exactly why my position as CEO is being threatened tonight." Victoria's eyes widened in sudden panic. "Sloane, do not do this," she hissed under her breath. Sloane ignored her completely. "My father left a clause in his will." Sloane continued, turning slightly so the cameras had a clear view of her face. "He stipulated that to maintain control of this empire, I needed to present a stable family. I needed a husband, a prop, a carefully constructed illusion of domestic perfection to satisfy the archaic, patriarchal standards of this board." Flashes from the cameras erupted like rapid fire. A massive wave of murmurs rolled through the elite crowd. "For the past 30 days, Sloane said, her voice echoing with a haunting, powerful calm, "I searched for a way to buy that illusion. I looked for someone desperate enough to sign a marriage contract for money. I found Elias Vance. I walked into his life, looked at his grief, looked at his massive medical debt from a tragic loss, and I offered him a blank check to be my puppet." Sloane paused. She turned her head to look at Elias. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, grounding warmth. He did not look angry that she was exposing the brutal truth. He looked profoundly proud of her. But he refused the money, Sloane said, looking back at the crowd. He chose to work 16-hour shifts, breaking his body in a mechanic shop, rather than sell his dignity to a billionaire. "He taught me that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with offshore bank accounts. It is about who you hold on to when the world falls apart." She took a slow, deep breath, the suffocating weight in her chest A weight she had carried since she was 7 years old finally began to lift. For my entire life, Sloane said, I believed that Kensington Holdings was my family. I believed that if I sacrificed my youth, my peace and my happiness, this company would love me back. But a glass tower does not love you. A boardroom does not hold your hand when you are sick. And this legacy, she gestured coldly toward Victoria, is built on nothing but greed and cruelty. Victoria stepped forward, her face pale and furious. "Cut the microphones," she yelled to the sound engineers at the back of the room. "I said cut them." No one moved. The press was too captivated. The room was entirely hers. "You do not have to cut the microphones," Victoria Sloane said softly, stepping directly into her aunt's personal space. "Because I am done talking." Sloane reached over to her right hand. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she slid the heavy gold signet ring off her finger, the ultimate symbol of the Kensington Empire. She held it out. Victoria stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "Take it," Sloane commanded, dropping the ring directly into Victoria's trembling palm. "You want the CEO title? It is yours. You want the corner office? Take it. You want the stress, the backstabbing, the cold, lonely nights, defending a stock price that means absolutely nothing to anyone? Have it all. I resign." The ballroom erupted into sheer absolute bedlam. Reporters shouted over one another, breaking the velvet rope line. Several senior investors, the men who actually held the financial backing of the company, immediately stood up from their tables. One of them, a silver-haired man who had mentored Sloane's father, looked directly at Victoria and shook his head in profound disgust. "You just killed the company, Victoria," he said, coldly, turning his back and walking towards the exit. Victoria stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant flush drained from her face, leaving her pale and terrified. She stared at the gold ring in her hand, suddenly realizing the horrific truth. She had orchestrated a coup to steal the throne, but she had absolutely no idea how to actually run the empire. Without Sloane's brilliant financial mind holding the fragile alliances together, Kensington Holdings stock would plummet the moment the market opened tomorrow. Victoria had won the crown, but the kingdom was already burning. Sloane did not stay to watch the ashes fall. She turned her back on her aunt, the board, and the flashing cameras. She walked over to Elias. He was smiling. It was a small, rare, beautiful smile that reached all the way to the corners of his dark eyes. "Are you ready to go home?" Elias asked, his low rumble cutting through the chaotic noise of the room perfectly. Sloane looked at him. She had just thrown away a $1 billion inheritance. She had no job. She had no corporate security. The penthouse would likely be seized by the board by tomorrow afternoon. But as she looked at the grease stains permanently etched into the hands of the man standing in front of her, she felt richer than she had ever been in her entire life. "Yes," Sloane whispered. "Let us go home." Elias held out his hand. Sloane placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, rough, and incredibly safe. They walked out of the grand ballroom together. They did not rush. They moved with the unhurried grace of two people who had just won a war. The crowd parted for them once again, but this time it was not out of fear of Sloane's wealth. It was out of absolute awe. When they pushed through the heavy brass doors of the Plaza Hotel and stepped out into the cool night air, the silence of the street felt like a physical blessing. The valet rushed forward, but Sloane shook her head. "I think the company owns that car," Sloane said, looking up at Elias with a sudden breathless laugh. "I actually do not have a ride." Elias chuckled, the sound deep and rich in his chest. He took off his suit jacket and gently draped it over her bare shoulders. The cheap fabric contrasted wildly with her emerald silk gown, but it was the warmest thing she had ever worn. "Good thing I drove the truck then," he said. "It is parked 3 blocks away. I did not want to leave an oil slick on their fancy driveway." Sloane pulled his jacket tighter around her. "Then we better start walking." They walked down the city blocks, holding hands under the quiet glow of the streetlights. The towering glass skyscrapers loomed above them, monuments to money and power, but Sloane did not look up at them anymore. She looked at the man walking beside her. She thought about a dusty garage, a broken plastic lunchbox, and a little girl who had offered her a half-eaten sandwich. She had lost the Kensington Empire, but she had finally found her soul. 6 months later, the yellow glow of a porch light cut through the cool evening air. Sloane Kensington sat on the top wooden step of Elias's modest home. She was not wearing an emerald silk gown or a white tailored suit. She wore a thick grey knitted sweater, faded jeans, and wool socks. She held a ceramic mug of hot chamomile tea, letting the steam rise against her face. There were no sirens here, no flashing cameras, no urgent emails pinging in the dark. There was only the gentle sound of the wind moving through the oak trees and the quiet breathing of the neighbourhood. For the past 6 months, Sloane had not stepped foot inside a corporate glass tower. Instead, she had taken over the accounting books for Elias's mechanic shop. With her brilliant financial mind and his flawless work ethic, they had cleared the remaining debt within 2 months. They had renegotiated supplier contracts, expanded the bays, and hired 3 new mechanics. The dusty, struggling garage was now a thriving, highly profitable business. The front screen door creaked open behind her. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He was freshly showered, his broad shoulders relaxed in a plain white t-shirt and dark sweatpants. The heavy exhaustion that used to carry his frame was completely gone. He looked younger. He looked deeply, profoundly happy. He sat down on the wooden step right behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. Sloane leaned into him instinctively, resting her head against his shoulder. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss to the side of her neck. "Maya is finally asleep," Elias said, his voice a low, comforting rumble against her skin. "She made you something." Elias reached over and placed a slightly crumpled piece of construction paper on Sloane's lap. Sloane set her tea down and carefully unfolded the paper. It was a drawing done in bright, heavy crayons. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a blue house, a tall man in dark clothes, a little girl in a yellow dress, and a woman. Above the woman's head, Maya had carefully written the word "Mom" in uneven block letters. Sloane stared at that single word. The tightness in her throat returned, but this time it was not from grief or pressure. It was from an overwhelming, pure gratitude. She traced her finger over the letters, a single tear escaping and sliding down her cheek, dropping onto the heavy paper. "She asked me today if we were going to stay together forever," Elias whispered, resting his chin on the top of Sloane's head. "I told her that some things are just built to last." Sloane turned her face, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "We are built to last," she promised quietly. They sat together in the peaceful silence. But in the corporate world, actions always have echoes. The next morning, the bell above the door of the mechanic shop rang sharply. Sloane was sitting behind the front desk, sipping diner coffee and reviewing a pile of invoices. She did not look up immediately, assuming it was a parts delivery. "Good morning," Sloane said, tapping her pen against the ledger. "Drop the filters by bay number 2, please." "We are not here to deliver filters," Sloane, a raspy, exhausted voice, replied. Sloane froze. She slowly lifted her head. Standing in the small waiting area of the garage, surrounded by the smell of hot oil and old tires, were 3 people. Aunt Victoria, the silver-haired investor named Sterling, and the chief legal officer of Kensington Holdings. The visual contrast was pathetic. Victoria was wearing a designer suit, but the aristocratic arrogance was completely gone. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were shadowed with deep panic and sleepless nights. Sterling looked furiously grim. Sloane leaned back in her cheap office chair. She did not stand up. She did not offer them a seat. She just looked at them with the calm, absolute authority of a woman who had already won. Victoria Sloane said smoothly, "Mr. Sterling, you look terrible." Sterling let out a heavy sigh, removing his hat. "There is no point in pretending, Miss Kensington. The company is bleeding out. In the 6 months since you resigned, the stock has plummeted by 60%. Victoria has managed to alienate our 3 largest international partners. The board is facing a massive revolt. We are weeks away from declaring bankruptcy and selling the assets for scrap." Victoria stared at the scuffed floorboards of the shop, entirely unable to meet Sloane's eyes. The humiliation of standing in a dirty garage begging the woman she had tried to destroy was absolute. "I warned you what would happen if you gave her the wheel," Sloane replied coldly. "I do not see how this is my problem. I fix broken ledges for this garage now." "I am very busy. Please, Sloane." Victoria finally spoke, her voice cracking, stripped of all its venom. "I was wrong. I was arrogant. The board sees that now. They want you back. They will reinstate you as CEO immediately. The family clause has been officially abolished." Sloane stared at the woman who had tormented her for years. Power built on cruelty always eventually collapses under its own weight. From the open bay doors, Elias walked in. He was wiping his hands on a shop towel. He saw the executives, but he did not stop or show any intimidation. He walked straight behind the desk, standing tall and immovable, right behind Sloane's chair, placing one heavy protective hand on her shoulder. Sloane looked up at him, drawing strength from his quiet dignity, then looked back at the board members. "I am not coming back to be your employee," Sloane said, her voice turning into steel. Victoria's face dropped in despair. But Sloane continued, "I will buy Kensington Holdings. I have liquidated all of my private offshore assets. I will purchase the controlling shares at their current crashed market value. I will become the absolute majority owner. There will be no board of directors to answer to. And my very first executive action will be firing you, Victoria, effectively, immediately, with 0 veto severance." The silence in the garage was deafening. Sterling looked at Sloane, recognizing the brilliant, ruthless mastermind that her father had created, but seeing something entirely new, a woman who was no longer driven by fear, but by absolute unshakable independence. Sterling nodded slowly. "I will have the legal team draw up the acquisition papers by this afternoon." As the executives turned and walked out of the garage looking completely defeated, Sloane let out a long breath. The ghosts of her past were finally buried. She had not just survived the fire, she had bought the ashes. Elias squeezed her shoulder gently. "You just bought a skyscraper?" He rumbled, a warm smile in his voice. "Does this mean I have to start wearing a suit again?" Sloane stood up, turning to face him. She reached up, resting her hands against his broad chest, entirely unbothered by the faint grease on his shirt. She looked deep into his dark, steady eyes. "No," Sloane whispered. "I think I prefer the coveralls, and I prefer the man wearing them." Elias lowered his head, capturing her lips in a deep, slow kiss that tasted like coffee survival and absolute devotion. Later that evening, Sloane stood in the small kitchen of Elias' house. She was packing a new, bright pink lunchbox for Maya. She carefully placed a sandwich inside, cutting off the crusts, and added a small, handwritten note. She remembered her own lonely childhood, the massive, empty dining table, the cold marble floors. She looked out the kitchen window. Elias was in the yard chasing Maya around the old oak tree, the sound of their loud, joyful laughter floating through the glass. Sloane smiled, closing the latch on the lunchbox. She had lost an inheritance to find a home. She had given up the illusion of power to find the reality of love. Because the greatest empire a person can ever build is not made of glass and steel. It is made of the people who choose to stay when the lights go out. And as the porch light flickered on, glowing warmly into the dark night, Sloane knew she was exactly where she belonged. What about you? Which moment in their story made your heart soften the most? Do you believe that true love requires us to lower our deepest defenses? Or do you believe that a child's simple kindness has the power to heal the most guarded adults? Let me know in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of healing, dignity, and second chances.